What if your greatest weakness was a lie? What if the one thing society told you to be ashamed of, the very thing that made you feel insignificant and overlooked, was secretly the key to saving everything? Ever wondered why your most sincere effort sometimes feels like it amounts to nothing? Why your unique talents are ignored while the world celebrates a narrow, polished version of success? You're not alone in feeling that way. It's a silent struggle for so many, the feeling of being fundamentally misjudged, of having a deep, untapped potential that the world simply refuses to see. We are told to clean up our rough edges, to fit into a mold, to discard the messy, chaotic parts of ourselves in favor of a more acceptable, sterile ideal. But what if that ideal is a cage? What if the path to true strength isn't about perfection, but about embracing the very complexity and chaos we've been taught to fear? This is a story about that very idea. It's the story of a man the galaxy called a janitor, the lowest of the low, and how he, and he alone, figured out how to stop an unstoppable invasion. It's a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, about weakness, and about the hidden potential lying dormant within the parts of ourselves we've been taught to hide. Because in this account of cosmic war and desperate survival, you will discover that sometimes the most profound power isn't found in shining armor or advanced technology, but in the grime, in the chaos, in the beautiful, resilient mess that is life itself. What you are about to hear is a testament to the idea that the universe rarely rewards conformity. It rewards adaptation, it rewards authenticity, and sometimes it rewards the very things that others deem worthless. The Galactic Consortium saw humanity as a charmingly primitive species. We were newcomers to the star lanes, a boisterous, chaotic race still carrying the mud of our homeworld on our boots. While the elder races like the crystalline Ciliards or the psionically gifted Vesperines had spent millennia perfecting their genetics and purifying their forms, humanity was a riot of biological noise. We were riddled with dormant viruses, our DNA a messy collage of evolutionary dead ends and redundant code. We carried trillions of microbes in our guts, on our skin, in our very breath. To the pristine and sterile races of the consortium, we were, to put it mildly, a bit disgusting. A walking, talking biohazard. Our perceived weakness defined our role in the galactic community. Humans were laborers, engineers, and technicians. We were good with our hands, good at fixing the complex systems that the more cerebral races designed but couldn't be bothered to maintain. We were the galaxy's plumbers, its mechanics, its janitors. And at the absolute bottom of that ladder was a man named Kaelen. His official title was Bioremediation Technician, Grade 7, assigned to the consortium's capital station, Citadel Prime. But everyone, from the lowest-ranking alien dockworker to the highest fleet admiral, knew what he was. He was a janitor. Kaelen's world was the underbelly of the Citadel. He walked the sanitation conduits, the waste reclamation sectors, the quarantine labs where alien bacteria were incinerated. He was a master of filth. He understood the complex dance of microbes, the subtle language of decay and regeneration. He could identify a ship's point of origin just by the scent of its refuse. He knew which cleaning agents would sterilize a Vesperine meditation chamber without disrupting its delicate psionic resonance, and which ones could scour the engine grease of a freighter from the Grull Nebula. The elites of the Citadel, with their gleaming chrome corridors and purified air, saw his work as distasteful but necessary. They saw him as a function, not a person, a biological cog in a grand, sterile machine. They never once imagined that his intimate knowledge of dirt was the single most valuable expertise in the entire galaxy. Then the Vex arrived. They didn't arrive in fleets of warships bristling with lasers and missiles. They arrived like a plague. The Vex were a hive mind, a biomechanical swarm that consumed and assimilated everything in its path. They were perfection incarnate, a force of absolute, terrifying order. A single Vex spore could land on a planet, and within days, the entire world would be transformed into a pulsating, geometric lattice of Vex biomass. Mountains, oceans, cities, all of it would be broken down and rebuilt in the Vex's image. They didn't conquer, they converted. They didn't destroy, they purified. To the Vex, all other life in its chaotic, messy imperfection was an error, a glitch in the fabric of the cosmos that needed to be corrected. The Consortium's response was immediate and overwhelming. The Grand Armada, a fleet of ships that could crack planets, met the Vex at the edge of Consortium space. They unleashed energies that could dwarf suns, and it did nothing. The Vex ships, living organisms themselves, simply healed. They adapted. They absorbed the energy from the Consortium's weapons and used it to grow stronger. The Consortium's ground troops, genetically engineered super soldiers who were immune to every known disease, were useless. The Vex didn't fight them with weapons. They simply touched them. A single touch and the soldiers' perfect genetics would be unwritten, their bodies dissolving into the raw material for the Vex's expansion. Panic gripped the galaxy. The elder races, who had seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, were being dismantled like children's toys. Their genetic purity, their sterile environments, their advanced technology, it was all just fuel for the Vex. The Vex were a biological storm, and the Consortium had forgotten how to exist in the rain. They had spent so long in their climate-controlled habitats that they no longer had an immune system for the raw, untamed universe. It was during the initial assault on Citadel Prime that the first clue appeared, a tiny, insignificant anomaly that everyone was too busy panicking to notice. Everyone except Kaelen. He was in Sanitation Sector Gamma 9, a sprawling maze of pipes and grinders that processed the organic waste from the Citadel's affluent upper levels. When the attack began, the station's emergency protocols kicked in, sealing all sectors. Red lights bathed the grimy corridors as the distant thuds of the Vex assault echoed through the metal. Kaelen was trapped. Through a reinforced viewport, he watched in horror as the Vex swarm flowed through the maintenance tunnels outside. They moved like liquid mercury, a shimmering, silver tide that flowed over everything. They touched a reinforced bulkhead, and the metal seemed to sigh, dissolving into the Vex mass. They swarmed over a squad of automated security drones, and the drones went silent, their lights extinguished as they were absorbed. But then something strange happened. The Vex tide reached the sealed entrance to Gamma 9. It was a standard pressurized airlock, no different from thousands of others on the station. But the Vex stopped. The shimmering, relentless wave recoiled as if it had touched a live current. It hesitated, probing the edges of the doorway, but it would not cross the threshold. It was like watching a predator suddenly become repulsed by the scent of its prey. The Vex swirled in confusion and frustration before finally flowing away, seeking easier paths. Kaelen stared, his heart pounding. He wasn't relieved, he was fascinated. What was in Gamma 9 that wasn't in the rest of the station? The air was the same recycled atmosphere. The walls were the same standardized alloy. The only difference was what was processed here. The waste. The half-eaten meals of a dozen different species, the shed skin cells, the discarded organic tissues, the literal refuse of a galactic civilization. The Vex, who could consume entire warships, were repulsed by garbage. This was the first win, a tiny, impossible observation. The unstoppable force had a weakness, and that weakness somehow was connected to filth. The thought was so absurd, so contrary to every principle of galactic warfare that he almost dismissed it. But Kaelen trusted his world. His world was one of tangible things, of cause and effect, of chemical reactions and biological imperatives. He had just witnessed an anomaly, and in his line of work, anomalies were never meaningless. They were clues. While the greatest minds in the consortium were looking to the stars for a solution, Kaelen started to wonder if the answer wasn't out there at all. He started to wonder if it was right here, in the dirt, in the mess, in the very thing everyone else had thrown away. The seed of an idea began to form, a wild, improbable hypothesis. What if humanity's greatest flaw, our biological chaos, was actually our most powerful weapon? For Kaelen, this revelation wasn't just a tactical insight. It was a profound shift in his own perception of self. His entire life, he had been defined by his association with waste. It was a mark of low status, a sign that he was fit for nothing more than cleaning up after his betters. And yet, in that moment, watching the Vex recoil from his world, he felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He saw a connection that the admirals and the scientists in their sterile clean rooms and strategic hollow tanks could never possibly conceive of. They saw the Vex as a technological or military problem. Kaelen saw them as a biological one, and biology was his domain. He began to really think about the nature of the Vex. The official reports called them a biomechanical hive mind. They consumed and assimilated. But Kaelen's mind went deeper. What does it mean to assimilate something? It means you have to break it down, understand its components, and then incorporate them into your own system. The Vex were masters of this. They could deconstruct the complex alloys of a starship and the advanced genetics of a ciliared warrior with equal ease. But what if their system, for all its power, had a blind spot? What if their system was too perfect, too ordered? Think of a master chef who can prepare the most exquisite, complex dishes from the finest ingredients. Now give that chef a pile of random, half-rotten garbage. They wouldn't know what to do with it. Their art is based on purity and precision. They have no process for handling chaos, for dealing with decay. Kaelen hypothesized that the Vex were like that chef. Their biology was designed to assimilate ordered, functional systems. A complex piece of technology is, at its heart, a system of pure order. The DNA of a genetically engineered Vesperine is a masterpiece of biological information, clean and efficient. But human biology, it was anything but clean. It was a chaotic symphony of coevolution. Trillions of bacteria live in our gut, not as invaders, but as partners. Our DNA is littered with the ghosts of ancient viruses, fragments of code that have been integrated into our genome over millions of years of fighting off infections. We are not a single organism, we are an ecosystem. A messy, resilient, constantly adapting ecosystem. This was Kaelen's revolutionary idea. The Vex's unstoppable assimilation process wasn't a weapon, it was their biology. And that biology, he suspected, was based on a principle of absolute purity. When they encountered something, their system would try to read it, decode it, and integrate it. But when they encountered a human, or more specifically, the miasma of microbes and biological noise that surrounds a human, their system would be overwhelmed. It would be like a supercomputer trying to process a file that was not just encrypted, but fundamentally corrupt and nonsensical. It wasn't just that it couldn't read the file. The very attempt to do so would cause its own systems to crash. The Vex weren't repulsed by the garbage in Sector Gamma 9 out of some sense of disgust. They were repulsed because it was biologically indigestible to them. The chaotic mix of half-decayed organic matter from dozens of species, the thriving colonies of bacteria and fungi, it was a biological static so loud that it jammed their assimilation process. It was poison, not a chemical poison, but an information poison. Now Kaelen had to prove it. He was locked in his sector, but he had a laboratory of sorts all around him. He began to experiment. He took samples from various waste conduits. He carefully cultivated colonies of specific bacteria he knew to be particularly resilient and, to be frank, smelly. He used the lab equipment in a small, forgotten hazardous materials station to analyze the Vex. Tiny, microscopic fragments of the Vex swarm, like dust motes, were circulating in the station's ventilation system. He managed to isolate a few of these active particles. In a sealed containment field, he exposed a Vex particle to a sample of purified, sterile nutrient solution, the kind used in the Citadel's high-tech medical bays. The particle instantly activated, multiplying rapidly, converting the entire solution into a tiny, shimmering replica of itself. This confirmed the official reports. Then he took another Vex particle and exposed it to a Petri dish containing a cocktail of common human gut bacteria he had painstakingly cultured from waste sludge. The result was astonishing. The Vex particle didn't just fail to assimilate the bacteria, it violently tore itself apart. The moment it tried to read the chaotic genetic information of the microbes, its own structure destabilized. It was as if it had touched anti-life. The perfect, ordered geometry of the Vex particle dissolved into a gray, inert sludge. Kaelen ran the experiment again and again, each time with the same result. It wasn't just one type of bacteria. It was the combination, the chaos, the sheer unpredictable messiness of a naturally evolved microbiome that was lethal to the Vex. He had found it. He had found the weapon that could win the war. It wasn't a bomb or a laser. It was the microscopic life teeming in the guts of the galaxy's most underestimated species. But knowing this and convincing the consortium were two vastly different challenges. Who would listen to a janitor? He was a ghost in the machine, a man whose existence was predicated on being unnoticed. His voice carried no weight in the halls of power where admirals and politicians were desperately clinging to their failed strategies. He tried to use the sector's internal comms system, but all channels were locked down for military use only. He was cut off, alone with a discovery that could save billions of lives. The siege on Citadel Prime was intensifying. Entire sections of the massive station had gone dark, converted into Vex territory. The casualty reports broadcast over the emergency channels were grim. The consortium's finest were being erased. Their flawless strategies were failing. Their unwavering belief in their own superiority was getting them killed. They were trying to fight a fire with a sword, completely misunderstanding the nature of their enemy. Kaelen knew he was running out of time. If the station fell, his discovery would die with him. He had to get the information out. He had to bypass the chain of command that would never listen to him. He needed a way to demonstrate his findings on a scale that couldn't be ignored. His eyes scanned his surroundings, the labyrinthine network of sanitation pipes, the waste disposal chutes, the ventilation systems. These were the arteries and veins of the Citadel, a hidden world that he knew better than anyone. The admirals had their star charts. He had his plumbing schematics. And he realized that if he couldn't get his voice to the bridge, he would have to make the entire station his laboratory. He would have to weaponize the Citadel's own filth. It was a desperate, insane plan. It would almost certainly get him executed for treason if he was caught, but the alternative was extinction. Kaelen took a deep breath, the recycled air thick with the familiar scent of ozone and organic compounds. He was a janitor. His job was to keep the station clean. But to save the station, he would have to make it the dirtiest place in the galaxy. He was about to start a new kind of war, a war fought not with plasma and shields, but with bacteria and decay. A war that only he knew how to win. The next phase of Kaelen's plan was a masterpiece of guerrilla engineering, born from a lifetime of navigating the Citadel's forgotten bowels. He knew that the Vex were expanding methodically, following the main power conduits and transport arteries of the station. They were a force of order, and they followed orderly paths. Kaelen's world, the sanitation network, was the opposite. It was a chaotic, tangled web that mirrored the very biological chaos the Vex couldn't process. This was his battlefield. His first objective was to create a firebreak, a line the Vex could not cross. He identified a key junction in the station's infrastructure, a nexus where dozens of power, data, and ventilation conduits converged. The Vex were pushing towards this nexus. If they took it, they could sever the command and control functions of the remaining Citadel forces. The official strategy was to fortify the nexus with platoons of elite guards and automated defense turrets. Kaelen knew this was just throwing more fuel on the fire. Instead, he went to work in the levels below, using his master access codes, codes that no one had bothered to change in decades because who would care about the janitor's access? He began to reroute sections of the sanitation system. His goal was to concentrate the most potent biological waste he could find and pump it into the ventilation shafts and service corridors surrounding the nexus. He needed to create an impassable zone of biological static. He started with the outflow from the xenobiology labs, where alien life forms were studied. The waste here was a cocktail of bizarre proteins and unclassifiable microbes, ordinarily neutralized and incinerated. Kaelen bypassed the incinerators. Then he tapped into the waste lines from the lower-deck residential blocks, home to dozens of different species, each with their own unique microbiome. It was a stew of unimaginable biological complexity. The crown jewel of his concoction, however, was the processed waste from the human sectors. He knew, instinctively and from his experiments, that this was the most potent ingredient. The sheer diversity of viruses, bacteria, and prions that humanity had co-evolved with was his secret weapon. Working feverishly, he turned a series of massive reclamation tanks into giant fermentation vats. He wasn't just pumping raw sewage, he was cultivating it. He introduced specific bacterial strains, creating a sourdough starter of anti-Vex microbes. The air in his sector grew thick and pungent, a smell that would have sent a sterile Ciliard into anaphylactic shock. To Kaelen, it smelled like hope. The day the Vex reached the Nexus was a turning point. The comms channels were filled with the panicked shouts of the guards. Their energy shields were failing, their weapons useless. The silver tide of the Vex was pouring into the corridors. The admirals on the bridge watched their tactical displays, seeing another critical sector about to turn from blue to Vex red. They prepared to write it off as another loss. Then Kaelen acted. He opened the floodgates. From hundreds of grates and vents in the walls, floor, and ceiling around the Nexus, a thick, foul-smelling, aerosolized mist began to spray out. It wasn't a gas that would kill a person, though it was deeply unpleasant. It was his cultivated microbial cocktail. It settled on every surface, infusing the very air with a fog of biological chaos. The effect on the Vex was instantaneous and catastrophic. The front line of the swarm, the part that had been dissolving bulkheads and soldiers moments before, seemed to freeze. The shimmering, geometric patterns that covered their surface flickered erratically. Then, like a corrupted digital file, they began to pixelate and decay. The silver tide didn't just retreat, it disintegrated. The Vex that were further back, untouched by the aerosol, sensed the danger. They recoiled violently, pulling back from the contaminated zone as if it were a blast furnace. On the bridge of the Citadel, there was stunned silence. The tactical display showed the Vex advance halting, then rapidly retreating from the Nexus. The sector, which had been moments from falling, was suddenly secure. The officers stared at their screens, utterly baffled. Their sensors registered a massive release of organic compounds, but they couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a sewage leak. It looked like a catastrophic failure of the sanitation system. They couldn't connect this disgusting, low-tech event with the retreat of the most powerful enemy they had ever faced. They assumed it was a coincidence, a bizarre fluke. They had no framework to understand what they had just witnessed. They had just been saved by a janitor's masterful command of filth, and they were complaining about the smell. This small victory, however, created a new problem for Kaelen. While he had saved the Nexus, he had also revealed his hand, at least partially. The station's engineering corps was dispatched to investigate the sanitation failure. They were methodical and by the book. They would eventually trace the rerouted pipes and bypassed incinerators back to him. He was a wanted man, a saboteur. He had committed dozens of violations of the Citadel's health and safety protocols. In the eyes of the law, he was a terrorist who had flooded a critical sector with hazardous waste. He had to go deeper underground. He abandoned his base in Gamma 9 and retreated into the oldest, most forgotten parts of the station's network. These were the original conduits from when the Citadel was first constructed centuries ago, long before the current automated systems were installed. They weren't on most modern schematics. Only the lifers, the old-timers in the maintenance crews, knew these routes, and Kaelen was one of them. As he moved through the dark, echoing tunnels, he began to see the war from a new perspective. The consortium was losing not because it was weak, but because it was rigid. Its strength was its weakness. It was a system built on the assumption that its own model of reality was the only one that mattered. Genetic purity was better than genetic diversity. Sterile environments were better than dirty ones. Order was better than chaos. The Vex were the ultimate expression of that philosophy, and they were showing the consortium the fatal flaw in its own logic. Kaelen, on the other hand, was a creature of chaos. He thrived in it. He understood that complex systems are not always improved by making them simpler or purer. Sometimes their strength lies in their redundancy, their messiness, their ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. Humanity wasn't a failed attempt at perfection. It was a masterclass in resilience. His new mission was twofold. First, he had to continue his guerrilla war, using his microbial weapons to protect key strategic points from the Vex. He became a phantom, a myth in the station's underbelly. Strange sewage leaks and air quality alerts would mysteriously precede a Vex retreat. Pockets of the station would suddenly become inhospitable to the invaders, coated in a strange, organic slime. The consortium military command remained baffled, attributing these events to the progressive breakdown of the station's systems under the strain of the siege. His second and more difficult mission was to find an ally. He needed to get his message to someone in a position of power who was capable of thinking outside the box. Someone who wasn't so blinded by dogma that they would dismiss his discovery out of hand. And that was the hardest part. The consortium was a culture of specialists. The biologists didn't understand military strategy. The strategists didn't understand sanitation engineering. And no one understood the holistic, interconnected system that Kaelen saw so clearly. He started monitoring communications, not the encrypted military channels, but the open, secondary channels used by scientists, medics, and civilian leaders. He was looking for a voice of reason, of dissent, of desperation. He found it in the transmissions of a xenobotanist named Dr. Aris. She was a Ciliard, a member of a crystalline species known for their logic and rigid adherence to scientific principles. But Aris was different. Her field was the study of invasive ecologies, how resilient, chaotic ecosystems could overwhelm and supplant more stable, perfected ones. She had been studying the Vex from a purely biological standpoint, and was growing increasingly frustrated that her reports were being ignored by the military command. In her transmissions to a small group of fellow scientists, she argued that the consortium was fighting the wrong war. "You cannot defeat a plague with a sword," she said in one broadcast that Kaelen intercepted. "You are trying to solve a biological equation with the wrong mathematical language. The Vex are not an army, they are a competing ecosystem. And they are winning because they are more efficient at exploiting the environment we have created." Kaelen felt a jolt of recognition. She was speaking his language. She hadn't figured out the specific weakness yet, the vulnerability to microbial chaos, but she was on the right path. She understood the fundamental nature of the enemy. He knew then that he had to risk everything to contact her. He had to find a way to get his data, his samples, his proof into her hands. It was a long shot. She was a respected scientist from an elite species. He was a human janitor and a wanted saboteur. To her, he was just another piece of chaotic, dirty humanity. But he had to try. The fate of the galaxy depended on it. How do you reach out to someone who lives in a completely different world, especially when you are being hunted through the guts of a dying space station? For Kaelen, the answer lay, as always, in the systems that no one else bothered to understand. He couldn't send an email or make a call. All his official access was flagged. But he did have access to the physical infrastructure of the station. Dr. Aris was working out of a high-security xenobiology lab in Sector Beta 4, one of the few remaining clean zones on the Citadel. Kaelen couldn't walk in the front door, but he knew where the lab's plumbing went. He located the dedicated bio-waste disposal line from her specific lab. It was a sealed, high-temperature conduit designed to carry hazardous materials directly to an incinerator. It was a one-way trip to oblivion, but Kaelen knew of a maintenance junction, an old, mechanically operated valve that had been scheduled for replacement for years, but was deemed a low priority. From a cramped service crawlspace, sweating under the heat of the nearby conduits, he managed to manually override the valve, creating a temporary diversion. He now had a direct, physical line into Dr. Aris's lab. His message couldn't be text, it had to be proof. He prepared a special sample. In a small, sterile containment vial he had salvaged, he placed one of the Vex particles. Then, using a delicate injector, he introduced a tiny droplet of his most potent microbial cocktail, the one cultured from human waste. He sealed the vial and then crafted a simple, shock-proof container for it. Alongside it, he placed a data chip. On it, he recorded a simple, anonymous message, his voice low and raspy. "Dr. Aris," the message began. "You said we are fighting a plague with the wrong weapons. You are right. The enclosed vial contains the right weapon. Do not analyze its chemical properties. Analyze its information density. Analyze its chaotic biological signature. Expose the Vex particle to it in a controlled environment. The answer is not in our strength, but in what you and your people have always considered our weakness. It's in our dirt. Our flaw is the cure." He wrapped the package carefully and sent it on its journey down the diverted waste line, a message in a bottle floating on a river of refuse. It was a desperate, almost laughable act of faith. He had no way of knowing if she would receive it, if she would dismiss it as contaminated garbage, or if she would even understand his meaning. All he could do was wait and continue his own secret war. Meanwhile, Dr. Aris was at her wit's end. The military command had just rejected another of her proposals, this one suggesting the introduction of a fast-growing, invasive fungus to try to choke the Vex's expansion. It was dismissed as primitive and uncontrollable. The admiral in charge had scoffed, saying, "We will defeat them with superior firepower and discipline, Doctor, not by throwing mud at them." She was in her lab, reviewing sensor logs from the incident at the Nexus, when a strange alert flashed on her terminal. The bio-waste analyzer for her lab was reporting an anomalous object in the disposal line. It was a small, sealed container of unknown origin. Protocol dictated that any such anomaly be immediately incinerated. But Eris was a scientist driven by curiosity, and her recent frustrations with protocol had made her bold. She overrode the command and had the station's robotic systems retrieve the container. When the strange, makeshift package arrived in her lab's sterile receiving chamber, she was both intrigued and repulsed. It was clearly cobbled together, and the external sensors detected trace organic residues that were complex, very complex. Her first instinct was to dispose of it, but something stayed her hand. It was the sheer audacity of it. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to get this specific object into her lab. She opened the package. The vial and the data chip were nestled inside. She listened to the message, her crystalline face impassive but her mind racing. "Our flaw is the cure." The words resonated with her own unpopular theories. She looked at the vial. It contained a shimmering Vex particle suspended in a sterile medium, and at the bottom was a small, separate bubble of some kind of biological slurry. Against her better judgment, and in direct violation of a dozen safety regulations, she decided to follow the anonymous messenger's instructions. She prepared a microscopic analysis chamber. She placed the Vex particle inside. Then she used a remote manipulator to inject the contents of the slurry. What she saw on her microscope's display made her entire logical, ordered ciliared mind come to a screeching halt. She had studied the Vex for weeks. She knew their resilience, their ability to self-repair, to assimilate, but she had never seen this. The moment the chaotic miasma of microbes touched the Vex particle, the particle convulsed. Its perfect geometric structure fractured. It was not a chemical reaction. It was something far more fundamental. It was, as the message said, an information failure. The Vex was trying to read the genetic code of the thousands of different species of bacteria and viruses in the sample, and it was like trying to download the entire galactic library through a single, faulty data port. The system overloaded. The Vex particle didn't just die. It underwent a catastrophic cascade failure, dissolving into inert proteins and lipids. Eris stared, unblinking, for a full minute. Then she reran the experiment, and again. The results were the same. It was true. The ultimate weapon against the ultimate order was ultimate chaos, and this chaos was embodied in the biology of the galaxy's most looked-down-upon race, humanity. Her entire worldview had been upended. She, a ciliard, a being of crystalline purity, had just discovered that the key to survival lay in the very biological filth her people had spent millennia trying to erase. The anonymous messenger, this janitor, was not a saboteur. He was a genius, a visionary who had seen the truth that was hidden in plain sight. She now faced the same dilemma as Kaelen. She had the proof, but she was a pariah among her own people, a Cassandra whose warnings had been repeatedly ignored. But now she had more than a theory. She had data. She had experimental proof, and she had an unlikely, unknown ally fighting a shadow war in the guts of the station. She immediately began working, not to convince the military, but to bypass them. She used her authority to requisition massive quantities of biological growth mediums and microbial samples under the guise of researching a Vex antidote. No one questioned the requests. They just assumed she was working on some kind of conventional vaccine. In reality, she was creating a production facility. She was using her advanced labs to replicate Kaelen's work on an industrial scale. She was turning her pristine, sterile laboratory into a factory for weaponized filth. She also sent a message back to Kaelen using the same unconventional channel. She synthesized a unique, harmless protein marker and flushed it down the waste disposal line. It was a signal that only the person who sent the package would understand. It meant, message received, I understand. I am with you. Deep in a dark conduit, a small sensor on one of Kaelen's salvaged monitors beeped. It had detected the protein marker. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for days. He wasn't alone anymore. The janitor and the scientist, from opposite ends of the galactic social ladder, had formed an alliance. Together, they were about to escalate their secret war, and the Vex would never know what hit them. The battle for Citadel Prime was about to enter a strange, new phase, one that would be remembered in the annals of galactic history not for its glorious explosions, but for its strategic galaxy-saving stink. The alliance between Kaelen and Dr. Aris marked a fundamental shift in the war. It was no longer one man's desperate struggle, but a coordinated, two-front operation. Kaelen was the field commander, the guerrilla warrior who knew the terrain. Aris was the quartermaster and the head of research and development, providing the ammunition. Aris's lab became the heart of the resistance. She and a small, trusted team of junior scientists, who she had convinced with her undeniable proof, worked around the clock. They transformed their gleaming, state-of-the-art xenobiology facility into a high-tech brewery for Kaelen's microbial weapons. They refined the cocktail, identifying the most potent strains of bacteria and viruses from the human biome and finding ways to cultivate them in massive quantities. They developed more effective dispersal methods, aerosols that could be pumped through ventilation systems, viscous gels that could be coated onto surfaces, and even biobombs that could be delivered to specific locations. Kaelen, receiving these enhanced munitions through their clandestine plumbing network, became exponentially more effective. He was no longer just creating defensive fire breaks. He was going on the offensive. He began a campaign of targeted strikes aimed at crippling the Vex infrastructure on the station. He knew that the Vex, for all their strangeness, still needed to process the material they assimilated. They created digestion hubs, massive organic structures deep inside their territory where they broke down the alloys and electronics of the station. These hubs were the Vex equivalent of a stomach, and Kaelen was about to give them a severe case of indigestion. Using the station's oldest, unmonitored maintenance conduits, he could get his bioweapons deep behind Vex lines. He would find a ventilation shaft or a fluid pipe that led to one of these hubs and pump gallons of Aris's most potent microbial gel into it. The effect was devastating. The hubs, which were the central processing units of the local Vex network, would suffer the same catastrophic information overload as the individual particles in Aris's lab, but on a macro scale. They would convulse, liquefy, and collapse, taking out huge swathes of Vex territory with them. From the perspective of the Consortium Command, these events were utterly mystifying. Entire Vex-controlled sectors would suddenly and inexplicably go dark. Their silver, geometric structures would decay into inert gray sludge. The admirals and strategists were baffled. Some started to believe the Vex had a built-in lifespan, that they were simply burning out. Others theorized it was a Vex civil war. The one thing they did not and could not comprehend was that this was the work of a human janitor and a renegade scientist. The partnership between Kaelen and Aris deepened. They communicated through their unconventional channels, sharing data and observations. Kaelen would report on the Vex's behavior in the field, and Aris would use that information to tweak the microbial formula. He was the hands, she was the brain. It was a perfect symbiosis, a microcosm of the very biological principle they were weaponizing. A man defined by his connection to the dirty, physical world, and a woman defined by her mastery of the clean world of pure science had found a common ground, a shared purpose that transcended the vast social and biological gulf between them. But their success was breeding a new kind of danger. As more and more Vex territory collapsed, the consortium military grew bolder. Not understanding the reason for the Vex retreat, they began to push forward, reclaiming the sectors that Kaelen and Aris had already neutralized. This created a huge risk. The consortium troops, with their sterile equipment and purified bodies, would move into these areas and begin decontamination procedures, which involved scouring every surface with potent sterilizing agents. They were, in effect, cleaning up Kaelen's weapons. They were destroying the very thing that was keeping them safe, preparing the ground for a renewed Vex assault. Kaelen and Aris realized they were in a race against not one, but two forms of ignorance: the all-consuming purity of the Vex and the arrogant, sterile mindset of the consortium. They had to find a way to reveal the truth. Simply telling the High Command was not an option. They would be arrested, their work would be stopped, and the Vex would inevitably adapt and overcome their current tactics. They needed a demonstration so dramatic, so undeniable, that it would shatter the consortium's worldview forever. Their target became the heart of the Vex infection on the station, the primary Gestalt. This was the first and largest Vex entity on Citadel Prime, located in the station's massive central core, where the primary power reactor used to be. It was the brain of the entire Vex operation on the station. Destroying it might not win the war, but it would be a blow from which the Vex could not easily recover. And more importantly, it was a target that the entire consortium command was focused on. They were preparing a massive, last-ditch military assault on the core, an operation that both Kaelen and Aris knew was doomed to fail and would cost thousands of lives. The plan they devised was the most audacious one yet. They would use the station's primary coolant system as a delivery mechanism. The massive pipes, each one the size of a transport tunnel, circulated millions of gallons of coolant fluid directly through the central core. If they could infuse this coolant with a massive dose of their microbial weapon, they could deliver a fatal injection directly into the heart of the beast. The challenge was immense. The primary coolant control center was one of the most heavily guarded and monitored locations on the station, and they needed to introduce not just a few gallons, but thousands of gallons of their cultivated slurry into the system at a precise moment. Aris took on the task of remote infiltration. She would slice into the control center systems, creating a small window of opportunity by looping the sensor feeds and temporarily disabling the alarms. It was incredibly risky. If she were detected, the entire plan would be exposed. Kaelen's job was even more dangerous. He had to physically deliver the payload. Aris's team had converted several large, mobile waste reclamation tanks into giant, pressurized containers for the microbial slurry. Kaelen had to transport these massive tanks through the treacherous underbelly of the station, right to the coolant injection point, a place deep in the engineering decks that was perilously close to Vex-patrolled territory. The journey was a tense odyssey through a forgotten world. Kaelen navigated the huge, cumbersome tanks through darkened, cavernous maintenance shafts, past the rusting hulks of decommissioned machinery, his path lit only by the headlamp on his suit. More than once he had to halt, hiding in the shadows as the shimmering patrol of a Vex scout flowed through a nearby corridor. He could feel the low, thrumming hum of the Vex hive-mined through the very metal of the deck plates, a constant, oppressive presence. He finally reached the injection point, a heavily shielded valve cluster connected to one of the main coolant arteries. He hooked up the tanks, his hands working with the sure, steady confidence of a man who had spent 30 years maintaining these very systems. He was ready. He sent a simple, coded signal to Aris. "Package is ready for delivery." On the Citadel bridge, the mood was grim. The grand assault on the core was about to begin. The Admiral gave the final order. Fleets of drones and heavily armed soldiers began their push down the main access corridors towards the central core. It was the very definition of a conventional attack, a head-on charge against an enemy that had never been defeated by such means. In her lab, Aris saw the military operation commence. It was now or never. "Kaelen, I'm opening the window. You have 90 seconds, she transmitted. She initiated her hack. On the main board in the coolant control center, a dozen warning lights that should have been flashing suddenly went green. The live sensor feed showing the pressure and purity of the coolant was replaced by a repeating 30-second loop of normal readings. "Go," Kaelen heard in his earpiece. He threw the main valve open. With a deep, shuddering groan, the thousands of gallons of concentrated microbial chaos began to surge into the primary coolant loop, a torrent of life's messiest secrets heading straight for the heart of the Vex's perfect order. For a moment, nothing happened. The military assault continued, meeting heavy resistance. The tactical display on the bridge showed horrific casualties as the Vex effortlessly absorbed the consortium's attack. The Admiral's face was a mask of grim determination, ready to sacrifice his entire force for a few inches of ground. And then the central core began to change. The light radiating from it, a pure silver-white, began to flicker. It turned a sickly yellow, then a muddy brown. The Vex structures on the surface, usually so sharp and geometric, began to soften and droop like wax melting. The thrumming sound of the hive mind, which had been a constant presence on the station, suddenly faltered, replaced by a discordant, shrieking noise that vibrated through the station. On the bridge, every officer stared at the main view screen in utter disbelief. The primary gestalt, the immense, terrifying brain of the Vex, was dying. It was collapsing in on itself, not from an external attack, but from a cancer within. It was rotting from the inside out. In a matter of minutes, the massive, continent-sized structure dissolved into a mountain of inert, gray sludge, leaving the station's original reactor core exposed and unharmed. With the collapse of the primary gestalt, the entire Vex network on the station went into a death spiral. The hive mind was shattered. The individual Vex swarms, now leaderless and disconnected, lost all cohesion. They ceased their advance, their structures decaying, their silver light extinguished. The great, unstoppable invasion of Citadel Prime was over. It hadn't been defeated by the Grand Armada or the elite soldiers. It had been defeated by a sewage leak. The silence on the bridge was absolute. The Admiral stared at the screen, his mind unable to process what he had just seen. The greatest military victory in consortium history felt. Disgusting. There was no glorious explosion, no heroic sacrifice that could be memorialized. There was just a mess. It was Aris who broke the silence. She opened a channel to the command bridge, her voice clear and steady. "Admiral," she said, her image appearing on the main screen. "The war is over, not because of your assault, which was a failure, but because of this." She brought up the data from her experiments, the microscopic footage of the Vex particle being destroyed by the microbial cocktail. She showed them sensor logs from the Nexus, from the other sectors that had mysteriously cleared. She showed them the coolant system readings, revealing the massive injection of organic material. And then she said the words that would change the galaxy forever. "For weeks, we have been saved by the work of one man. You have been calling the results of his work sanitation failures and biohazard leaks. You have listed him as a saboteur and hunted him. But the man you call a janitor is the one who saved us all. He understood that our perceived greatest weakness, the chaotic, messy, impure biology of humanity, was our greatest strength. He weaponized the very thing you despise. You did not win this war. You were saved by the dirt you walk on." Then she brought up another image on the screen. It was a grainy security camera feed from the dark, cavernous engineering deck. It showed a lone figure in a stained maintenance uniform standing beside the massive coolant pipes, his face weary but resolute. It was Kaelen, humanity's janitor, the man who knew how to stop the invasion. The aftermath was a period of profound and uncomfortable reevaluation for the entire Galactic Consortium. The war wasn't truly over. The Vex were a galactic threat, and what happened on Citadel Prime was just one victory. But the path to winning was now clear, and that path was humbling. It required the elder races to abandon millennia of dogma about purity and perfection, and to embrace a strategy born from the biological chaos of their most junior member. Kaelen was no longer a wanted man. He was, to his immense discomfort, a hero. He was brought from the station's underbelly to its highest spires, blinking in the clean, bright light. Admirals and ambassadors who wouldn't have given him a second glance now hung on his every word. He and Dr. Aris were placed in charge of Project Chimera, the official, galaxy-wide initiative to weaponize human biology against the Vex. It was a strange and surreal new life for Kaelen. He traded his maintenance uniform for the crisp, formal attire of a high-level advisor. He traded his cramped workshop in the sanitation sector for a state-of-the-art laboratory. But his core identity remained unchanged. He was still the man who understood the systems no one else did. Now, the system he was in charge of maintaining was the very survival of the galaxy. He and Aris worked together, scaling up their operation. They established massive bioreactors on dozens of worlds, cultivating trillions of gallons of the anti-Vex microbial cocktail. The ammunition was distributed to every fleet, every outpost on the front lines. The nature of the war changed completely. Starship battles were no longer about energy weapons and shields. They were about delivering the biological payload. The most celebrated naval officers were not the hotshot fighter pilots, but the delivery specialists who could get a biotorpedo into a Vex Hive ship's ventilation system. Humanity's status in the galaxy was irrevocably altered. We were no longer the charming, primitive laborers. We were the saviors. Our biology, once a source of mild disgust for the elder races, was now the most precious resource in the known universe. Human colonists, once relegated to marginal worlds, were now sought after. Their very presence on a planet, the establishment of their unique microbiome, acted as a natural defense against Vex incursion. Going native on a human-settled world became the ultimate planetary shield. The elder races had to confront their own hubris. The Ciliards, like Aris, had to accept that their logical purity was a vulnerability. The Vesperines, with their psionic gifts, had to acknowledge that there were forces in the universe that could not be mastered by the mind alone. It was a difficult, painful lesson. Entire philosophies and social structures had to be re-examined. They had built a galactic civilization based on the idea of transcending their messy biological origins, only to discover that their salvation lay in embracing them. Kaelen became a reluctant symbol of this new paradigm. He was a constant, living reminder that wisdom and value could be found in the most unexpected places. He never grew comfortable with the accolades or the ceremonies. He often found himself wandering down to the maintenance levels of whatever station he was on, just to talk to the technicians and the engineers, the people who, like him, understood how things actually worked. He felt more at home in a noisy engine room than in a silent council chamber. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that, where you understood the real problem, the simple, tangible truth of a matter, while everyone around you was lost in abstract theories and complicated, elegant strategies that were doomed to fail? It's a profoundly isolating feeling, to see the answer so clearly and not be able to make anyone else listen. Kaelen's story became a legend, a testament to the underdog, a story told to inspire children on 100 different worlds. But for Kaelen himself, it was simpler. It was a story about paying attention. It was about seeing the value in things that others discarded. It was about understanding that in any complex system, whether it's a space station or a civilization, the most important parts are often the ones that do the dirty work, the ones that are messy, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. The war against the Vex raged on for years, but the outcome was never again in doubt. The consortium, armed with Kaelen's discovery and Aris's science, slowly, methodically, began to push the Vex back. They didn't exterminate them, that was never the goal. They inoculated the galaxy. They created a vibrant, chaotic, and resilient galactic microbiome that the Vex simply could not process. They fought a plague with a competing form of life. They fought perfect order with beautiful, glorious chaos. In the end, Kaelen returned to his roots. He resigned his formal position as head of Project Chimera, leaving the administration to others. He took on a new title, one he created for himself, Galactic Systems Engineer. His job, as he defined it, was to travel the galaxy and study its plumbing, its ecosystems, its forgotten colonies, its complex, interdependent systems. He was still a janitor in a way. But now, his job wasn't just to clean up messes. It was to understand them, to cultivate them, and to recognize the hidden strength within them. His story serves as a permanent, powerful reminder. It projects a benefit far beyond a simple tale of alien invasion. It tells us that our efforts do equal results, but only when we apply them to the right problems with the right perspective. It shows us that true credibility comes not from titles or prestige, but from a deep, authentic understanding of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. This journey from a despised janitor to a galactic savior holds a mirror to our own lives. It asks us to reflect on the parts of ourselves we have been told are weaknesses. Our sensitivity, our passion, our unconventional way of thinking, our messy, complicated pasts. The world, like the Galactic Consortium, often pressures us to sterilize these parts of ourselves, to present a polished, perfect, pure version to the public. We are told that this is the path to success. But Kaelen's story teaches us a different lesson. It teaches us that these things are not our flaws. They are our texture. They are the source of our resilience, our creativity, our unique perspective. They are the complex, chaotic, and beautiful ecosystem that makes us who we are. And in a world that is increasingly demanding conformity and sterile perfection, embracing our own inner mess might be the most powerful act of rebellion we have. It might be the very thing that allows us to solve the problems that the perfect people can't even see. So as you move forward from here, carry this story with you. Let it be a spark that ignites a new way of seeing yourself and the world. The next time you feel overlooked, the next time your unique talents are dismissed, the next time you are made to feel ashamed of the very things that make you different, remember humanity's janitor. Remember that the fate of a galaxy was saved not by its shining knights, but by the one man who understood the power of dirt. And ask yourself this: what is the dirt in your own life? What is the messy, chaotic, and powerful truth about yourself that you have been taught to hide? And what could you achieve if you stopped trying to clean it up and started to see it as your greatest weapon?